Imagine this. You arrive at a monastery, tired and dusty from a long journey, and the head monk himself rushes out, bows deeply, and then personally washes your feet. And get this, they believed that in welcoming you, they were welcoming Jesus Christ in person. Some monasteries even had special better food cooked for guests in a separate kitchen, while the monks ate much simpler meals. And if you were a really important visitor, they might even ring the monastery bells to announce your arrival. Wild, right? But this was all part of a super serious set of rules for hospitality in medieval monasteries and convents. Let's dive into how they rolled out the welcome mat, medieval style. Number 11. The gatekeeper's first impression was everything. Picture the scene. A massive stone monastery, often with high walls, looking a bit like a fortress. You wouldn't just wander in. The first person a traveler would usually encounter was the porter, or gatekeeper. This wasn't just any monk assigned to door duty. The Rule of Saint Benedict, a guidebook for many monasteries, said the porter should be a wise old monk. Why old and wise? Because he needed to know how to give a blessing and receive one, and to do it with all gentleness and the fear of God. He was the first face of the monastery. His little room or lodge was often right by the gate, so he could respond super fast. As soon as someone knocked or called out, he was expected to reply with Deo gratias, thanks be to God, or benedicite, bless you. It was like saying, welcome, you've come to a godly place. This immediate, warm, and holy greeting was crucial. It set the tone. It told the traveler, you are safe here, and you are respected. The porter wasn't just a friendly greeter, though. He also had to be a bit of a security guard. He'd assess the visitor. Are they a pilgrim, a nobleman, a poor beggar, or someone just needing shelter for the night? He needed to be discerning. He couldn't just let anyone wander into the cloister, the private area where monks lived and prayed. That was a sacred space. So, the porter would often ask who they were and what they wanted. He had to be polite but firm. Once the porter understood the guest needs, he would usually hurry to inform the abbot, the head of the monastery, or the guest master, who was a monk specifically in charge of looking after visitors. He wouldn't leave the guest waiting awkwardly at the gate for too long. Speed and attentiveness were key. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a concierge and a security desk all rolled into one. This first interaction at the gate was designed to make the guest feel both honored and secure, and to ensure the monastery's peace wasn't unduly disturbed. It was a delicate balance managed by this wise old monk, stationed right at the threshold between the outside world and the sacred enclosure. His role was vital, a true ambassador of monastic welcome. He was the first link in a chain of hospitality that was taken incredibly seriously. Number 10. You were literally greeted as Jesus Christ. This is probably one of the most mind-blowing aspects of medieval monastic hospitality. The Rule of Saint Benedict, which was like the ultimate handbook for monks, stated very clearly in chapter 53. All guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ, for he himself will say, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. This wasn't just a nice saying. It was a command they lived by. So when a guest arrived, especially if they were unknown or poor, the monks were instructed to show them profound reverence. Imagine the abbot, or a group of monks, sometimes the whole community, coming out to meet the guest. They would bow their heads low, or even prostrate themselves on the ground before the visitor. Yes, you read that right, lying face down on the floor. This was an act of deep humility and a recognition of Christ in the person of the guest. After this initial, powerful gesture of humility, they would often say a prayer together with the guest. This immediately brought a spiritual dimension to the encounter. It wasn't just about providing food and shelter. It was about a spiritual connection. Then the guest would be given the kiss of peace. This was a formal, respectful kiss, often on the cheek or hands, a common greeting in that era, but loaded with extra meaning in this context. It symbolized fellowship and Christian love. However, there was a little note of caution. The rule also said that this kiss of peace should be offered after the prayer to avoid any diabolical illusions. This suggests they were aware that not every encounter might be pure, and prayer was a way to sanctify the greeting and protect against any trickery, either human or supernatural. Think about the impact of such a welcome on a weary traveler. You might be covered in mud, exhausted, maybe even feeling a bit lost or scared. And then, these men or women of God treat you as if you are the most important person in the world, as if you are Christ Himself. It must have been an incredibly powerful and moving experience. This wasn't just about being polite. It was a core tenet of their faith, put into dramatic, physical action. It demonstrated that their service to others was, in their eyes, service to God. This profound belief shaped every other aspect of how guests were treated. Number 9. Get ready for a VIP foot spa, Medieval style. Okay, so maybe spa is a bit of a stretch, but one of the most striking acts of hospitality was the washing of the guests' feet. This practice, known as the mandatum, from the Latin word for commandment, referring to Christ washing the apostles' feet, was a huge deal in monasteries. It wasn't just for show, it was a deeply symbolic act of humility and service. After the initial greeting and prayer, the abbot himself, the leader of the entire monastic community, would often lead the guest to a designated place to perform this ritual. Sometimes other monks would assist. They would gently remove the guest's shoes and stockings, which after days or weeks on medieval roads were probably not smelling like roses. Then they would pour water over the guest's feet and wash them often with their own hands, and then dry them with a towel. Imagine the head of a large, powerful institution kneeling before you, a simple traveler, and washing your dirty feet. It was a direct imitation of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples at the Last Supper, as described in the Gospel of John. For the monks, this was a powerful reminder to remain humble and to serve others, no matter their own status. It was putting their faith into very practical, very physical action. This wasn't just for fancy guests either. The rule of Saint Benedict specifically mentions that this honor should be shown to all guests, especially pilgrims and the poor, because it was in them that Christ was more especially received. So the tired, footsore pilgrim, who might have felt insignificant in the wider world, was given this incredible mark of respect and care. And it didn't stop there. After washing their feet, the rule also prescribed that the monks should say a specific verse. "We have received your mercy, O God, in the midst of your temple." This, again, linked the act directly to a spiritual understanding. It wasn't just about hygiene or comfort, though it certainly provided that. It was about recognizing God's presence in the guest and offering mercy and service as an act of worship. This ritual of foot washing would have been an unforgettable experience for any visitor, powerfully conveying the monastery's commitment to humility and Christ-like service. It was a level of personal care that went far beyond what anyone would expect in the ordinary world. Number 8. Guests got better digs and food than the monks. It might sound a bit backwards, but monasteries often went out of their way to make guests more comfortable than the monks themselves, especially when it came to food and accommodation. This was all part of that welcoming Christ philosophy. Many larger monasteries had a dedicated guest house, sometimes called a hospitium or xenodochium, from Greek words meaning a place for strangers. This wasn't just a spare room. It could be a substantial building, sometimes located near the main gate, so guests wouldn't disturb the monks' private areas too much. These guest houses often had their own staff, including a guest master monk whose whole job was to look after visitors. Inside these guest houses, things could be relatively comfortable, at least by medieval standards. Guests might have individual cells or small rooms, perhaps with better bedding than the monks, who often slept in communal dormitories on simple pallets. There might be a separate dining hall for guests, and even a separate kitchen. And this is where it gets really interesting: the food. The rule of Saint Benedict actually instructed the abbot to eat with the guests, and to break his own fast for them unless it was a major fast day for the whole community. The rule also stated, "Let the kitchen of the abbot and guests be apart, so that guests who are never lacking in a monastery and arrive at irregular hours may not disturb the brethren." This meant that the guest kitchen could prepare food that was different and often richer than what the monks ate in their refectory. Monks typically followed a very simple, often vegetarian diet. Meat was usually forbidden for most monks or only allowed for the sick, but guests, they were often served meat, wine, and finer bread. The idea was that guests were coming from the world and were used to a different standard of living. It was also a way to honor them. The abbot, when dining with guests, would also partake of this richer food, showing solidarity with them. However, the other monks generally stuck to their plainer fare. So, while the monks were living a life of austerity and self-denial, they made sure their guests didn't necessarily have to. This wasn't seen as a contradiction, but as a fulfillment of the duty of hospitality. It was about making the guest feel truly welcomed and honored. Of course, the level of luxury would vary. A poor pilgrim might get a clean bed and a hearty, simple meal, while a visiting nobleman or bishop might expect and receive something much grander. But the principle remained. The guests' needs and comfort were paramount, sometimes even above the daily deprivations of the monks themselves. Number 7. The head honcho personally waited on you. We've touched on this, but it deserves its own spotlight because it's so remarkable. The abbot for a monastery of monks, or the abbess for a convent of nuns, the top leader, the big boss, had a personal and direct role in welcoming and caring for guests. This wasn't something they just delegated and forgot about. The rule of Saint Benedict was very clear. The abbot was to be deeply involved. Imagine you arrive, and after the initial greeting, It's the abbot himself who leads you to have your feet washed. It's the abbot who sits and eats with you in the guest refectory, sharing your food and conversation, within certain limits, of course. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was hands-on. The rule stated, "The abbot shall pour water on the hands of the guests, and the abbot, as well as the whole community, shall wash the feet of all guests." While in practice, the whole community might not always wash every single guest's feet. Especially in large monasteries, the abbot's participation was a key element. Why this personal involvement from the leader? Firstly, it set an example for all the other monks. If the abbot, who held the highest authority, humbled himself to serve guests, then no other monk could consider such tasks beneath them. It reinforced the importance of humility and service throughout the community. Secondly, it directly reflected the idea of Christ being present in the guest. If the guest is Christ, then who better to serve him than Christ's representative in the monastery, which is how the abbot was viewed. The abbot was seen as taking the place of Christ in leading the community, so it was fitting for him to serve Christ in the person of the guest. Thirdly, it provided an opportunity for the abbot to interact with people from the outside world. This could be important for the monastery's connections, for gathering news in an age without mass media, and for offering spiritual guidance if the guest sought it. The abbot was often a figure of significant learning and spiritual wisdom. The rule even specified that the abbot should break his own fast to eat with guests, unless it was a particularly important fast day for the entire community. This showed that the needs of the guest could, in certain circumstances, override the abbot's personal ascetic practices. This wasn't about the abbot indulging himself. It was about making the guest feel comfortable and honored. The guest wasn't expected to adhere to the strict monastic dietary rules. This personal attention from the highest authority in the monastery sent a powerful message. It showed that hospitality wasn't just a chore or a secondary duty. It was a central, vital part of monastic life, led from the very top. It must have made guests, whether rich or poor, feel incredibly valued and respected. Number 6. Don't expect gossip. Monks weren't allowed to casually chat with you. So you're being treated like royalty, feet washed, good food, the abbot's attention. You might think this is a great chance to have a good old chinwag with the monks, find out all the local news, or share your life story. Well, not so fast. While hospitality was paramount, so was the monk's primary calling, a life of prayer, work, and silence. The rule of Saint Benedict, and monastic custom in general, placed a high value on silence. Silence was considered essential for contemplation, for hearing the voice of God, and for maintaining discipline within the community. Idle chatter was seen as a distraction and a spiritual danger. Because of this, ordinary monks were generally not supposed to mingle freely with guests or engage in casual conversation. The rule stated, "Let no one, unless he is bidden, presume to associate or speak with guests." This was quite strict. If a monk encountered a guest, he was to greet them humbly, ask for a blessing, and then pass on, explaining that he was not permitted to speak with a guest without permission. This wasn't meant to be rude. It was about protecting the monastic enclosure and the monk's life of prayer. The guest master, and perhaps the abbot or other designated senior monks, were the ones officially tasked with conversing with guests, seeing to their needs, and providing companionship. These appointed monks could speak with guests, answer their questions, and offer spiritual counsel if requested. Think of it like this: the monastery was a finely tuned spiritual machine. Unregulated interactions could throw a wrench in the works. The monks had a very structured day, filled with communal prayer, the Opus Dei or Work of God, sacred reading, Lectio Divina, and manual labor. Constant interruptions from chatting with visitors would disrupt this rhythm and the atmosphere of quiet contemplation they strove to maintain. So, while guests were treated with immense honor and care, they were also kept somewhat separate from the main body of the community. They would usually eat in a separate refectory, sleep in a separate guest house, and their interactions would be primarily with those monks specifically assigned to them. This created a kind of respectful boundary. Guests were honored, but the core life of the monastery had to continue undisturbed. This rule against casual chatter also protected the monks from worldly distractions. Guests brought news, stories, and concerns from the outside world, the very world the monks had, in a sense, renounced. Limiting these conversations helped the monks stay focused on their spiritual path. So if you visited a medieval monastery, you'd be incredibly well looked after. But don't expect to become best buddies with every monk you saw. Their silence was part of their sacred duty. Number 5. Your spiritual well-being was also on the menu. Monastic hospitality wasn't just about providing a bed for the night and a hot meal. These were communities dedicated to God, so it's no surprise that the spiritual welfare of their guests was also a major concern. They didn't just feed your body, they aimed to nourish your soul too. One of the key ways they did this was through the reading of sacred texts. The rule of Saint Benedict specifically says, "Let the divine law be read before the guest for his edification, and then let all kindness be shown him." So after the initial welcome, perhaps even before or during a meal, a portion of scripture or some other spiritual writing would be read aloud. This wasn't just background noise, it was intended to instruct, inspire, and comfort the guest. Imagine sitting down to eat, and instead of idle talk, you hear passages from the Bible or the lives of the saints. It would immediately set a spiritual tone for your stay. This reading wasn't necessarily a sermon or a lecture, but rather an offering of spiritual food alongside the physical meal. It reminded the guest that they were in a holy place, a place dedicated to seeking God. Guests were also often invited to join the monks for their formal prayer services in the church or oratory. The divine office, the cycle of psalms, hymns, and prayers recited by the monks at set times throughout the day and night, was the heartbeat of the monastery. While guests weren't required to attend all of these, some happened in the middle of the night, they were usually welcome. Participating in these ancient and beautiful liturgies could be a deeply moving spiritual experience for a visitor. The monks themselves, especially the abbot or the guest master, would also be available for spiritual conversation if the guest desired it. If a traveler was burdened seeking guidance or simply wanted to talk about matters of faith, these monks were often learned and spiritually experienced individuals who could offer counsel and prayer. This was an important form of pastoral care. Even the act of blessing was a constant spiritual offering. The porter blessed the guest upon arrival. The guest asked for a blessing from monks they encountered. Prayers were said with and for the guest. The whole atmosphere was suffused with a sense of the sacred. So, a stay in a medieval monastery was intended to be a holistic experience. Yes, your physical needs were met with remarkable generosity, but the monks also saw it as their duty and privilege to offer spiritual refreshment. They wanted you to leave, not just rested and fed, but also perhaps a little closer to God. This spiritual dimension was inseparable from their understanding of true hospitality. Number 4. They had a whole department for poor visitors. While all guests were to be welcomed as Christ, medieval monasteries often made a special point of caring for the poor, the sick, and pilgrims who might not have any other means of support. This wasn't just a casual afterthought. It was often a structured part of the monastery's operations, sometimes managed by a specific monk called the almoner. The almoner was essentially the monastery's charity officer. His role was to distribute alms, food, clothing, sometimes money, to the needy who came to the monastery gates. This was distinct from the hospitality offered in the main guest house, which might cater more to travelers who could potentially offer something in return, or who were of higher social standing, though the poor were not excluded there either. The almonry was specifically for charitable relief. Many monasteries had an almonry building, often located near the gate, where the poor could gather to receive assistance. Daily doles of bread or leftover food from the monks' and guest tables were common. On special feast days or anniversaries of the monastery's benefactors, larger distributions might take place. Some almoneries even included a small infirmary or hospice to care for sick paupers. This focus on the poor was deeply rooted in Christian teaching, such as the gospel imperative to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and shelter the homeless. Monasteries, often being significant landowners and recipients of donations, saw it as their Christian duty to share their resources with those less fortunate. The rule of Saint Benedict itself emphasizes special care for the poor and pilgrims, because in them more especially Christ is received. The almoner had to be a compassionate, but also a practical person. He needed to manage the resources carefully, ensuring that aid went to those genuinely in need. He might also be responsible for finding lodging for very poor travelers who couldn't be accommodated in the main guest house, perhaps in a simpler shelter associated with the almonry. In some traditions, there was even a symbolic act where a certain number of poor people were regularly fed within the monastery, sometimes in memory of the apostles, or as an act of penance or charity by the community or its benefactors. For example, the Cluniac customs from the influential monastery of Cluny prescribed that 12 poor men should be lodged and fed daily. This systematic approach to charity meant that monasteries often functioned as vital social safety nets in medieval society, especially in areas where there was little other organized support for the destitute. The almoner and the almonry were the tangible expression of the monastery's commitment to Matthew 25. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. It was hospitality extended to its most vulnerable recipients. Number 3. Not everyone got the same 5-star treatment. While the core principle was welcome all guests as Christ, the reality of medieval monastic hospitality was a bit more nuanced. Let's be honest, medieval society was very hierarchical, and monasteries, while aspiring to a spiritual ideal, were still part of that world. So, the kind of reception a guest received could vary, depending on who they were. A powerful nobleman, a bishop, or even royalty visiting a monastery would likely receive a very elaborate welcome. There might be processions, special ringing of bells, and the guest would be housed in the finest rooms in the guest house. The food and wine served would be of the highest quality the monastery could offer. This was partly about showing due respect to their rank, but it was also practical. These were important people who could be powerful patrons, or conversely dangerous enemies. Maintaining good relations was crucial for the monastery's survival and prosperity. The abbot would certainly spend significant time with such guests. Clergy, fellow monks from other monasteries, or respected religious figures would also be received with great honor, perhaps with more emphasis on spiritual fellowship, shared prayer, and learned conversation. They were, in a sense, colleagues in the spiritual life, and their visits were opportunities for mutual encouragement and exchange of knowledge. Then there were the ordinary travelers, merchants, pilgrims of modest means, or people simply seeking a night's shelter. They would receive the standard generous hospitality prescribed by the rule: a warm welcome, foot washing, a clean bed, and wholesome food. The guest master would attend to them, and they would be treated with kindness and respect. And then, as we discussed, there were the very poor and destitute who were often cared for through the almonry. Their reception might be simpler, focused on basic needs like food and shelter, but it was still offered with a spirit of Christian charity. The rule of Saint Benedict itself hints at some distinctions. For instance, it says the abbot should dine with guests, implying a certain level of interaction. But it also says, "Let the kitchen of the abbot and guests be apart, so that guests may not disturb the brethren." This practical separation allowed for different standards. And while all guests were to be honored, the rule specifically notes, "Let special care be shown in the reception of the poor and of pilgrims, because in them more especially Christ is received." This suggests a particular spiritual emphasis on these humble visitors, even if the material reception for a king might be grander. There were also rules about who not to receive, or how to receive them with caution. For example, an excommunicated person was not to be given the kiss of peace or share meals with the community in the same way, though they might still be offered basic shelter out of charity if they were in dire need. Prudence was also necessary. Not every stranger was trustworthy. So, while the underlying spirit was one of universal welcome, the practical expression of that hospitality was often tailored to the guest's social standing, their needs, and their relationship to the church and the monastic community. It was a complex balancing act between spiritual ideals and the social realities of the medieval world. Number 2. Leaving was a whole other ceremony. Just as the arrival of a guest was marked with specific rituals and care, so was their departure. Monks didn't just wave you off from the gate with a casual bye. The process of saying farewell was also considered an important part of hospitality, ensuring the guest left with a feeling of peace and blessing. When it was time for a guest to leave, they wouldn't just slip away unnoticed. The guest master, and often the abbot, if the guest was significant or had stayed for a while, would be involved. There would likely be prayers said for the guest's safe journey. Blessings were a key part of this. The guest might ask for a blessing from the abbot or the community, and in turn the monks would pray for God's protection to be upon the traveler as they ventured back out into the world. Sometimes, if the guest was poor or a pilgrim, they might be given provisions for their journey, a bit of food perhaps, some mended clothes if the almonry had provided them, or even a small amount of money if the monastery's customs allowed and the need was great. This was another practical expression of care. ensuring the guest didn't leave empty-handed if they were in want. For more distinguished guests, the farewell might be more formal. They might be escorted to the gate by a group of monks, perhaps with the abbot himself leading the way. There might be final words of thanks exchanged, the guest thanking the monastery for its hospitality, and the monks thanking the guest for the honor of their visit, remembering they were welcoming Christ. The rule of Saint Benedict doesn't go into as much detail about departures as it does about arrivals, but the spirit of careful, respectful attention would undoubtedly continue. The aim was to ensure the guest left feeling well cared for, spiritually refreshed, and with a positive impression of the monastic community. The last interaction was as important as the first. In some cases, if a guest had been particularly generous or was a long-standing patron, their departure might even be recorded, or there might be an understanding of future support or communication. Monasteries were part of a wider network, and good relationships, carefully cultivated through hospitality, were important. The overall feeling was that the guest who had been Christ in their midst was now departing and should be sent on their way with honor and God's blessing. It was the final act in a sacred drama of welcome and care. It wasn't just about closing a door. It was about sending someone forth, hopefully bettered in body and spirit by their time within the monastery's walls. This careful attention to departures underscored the deep seriousness with which medieval monks and nuns approached their duty of hospitality. From the first knock on the gate to the final wave goodbye. Number 1. Hospitality was so important, it was literally a holy command. This is the bedrock of everything we've talked about. The intense, sometimes elaborate hospitality practiced in medieval monasteries wasn't just because monks were nice people, though many undoubtedly were. It was a sacred duty explicitly commanded in their guiding texts, most notably the Rule of Saint Benedict. This rule, written in the 6th century, became the blueprint for Western monasticism and profoundly shaped its approach to welcoming outsiders. Chapter 53 of the Rule of Saint Benedict is titled On the Reception of Guests, and it lays out the core principles. The very first line sets the tone. All guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction. It then quotes the Gospel of Matthew 25:35. For he himself will say, I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. This direct link to the words of Jesus made hospitality not just a social grace, but an act of religious obedience, a way of encountering and serving Christ himself. This chapter goes on to detail many of the practices we've discussed. The abbot and community meeting the guest, praying with them, the washing of feet, the separate kitchen for guests, the abbot eating with guests, and the careful appointment of a guest master. Every detail was designed to fulfill this primary command of welcoming Christ in the person of the stranger. The emphasis was on humility and service. The monks, who had dedicated their lives to renouncing worldly status, were to humble themselves before guests. The abbot, the leader, was to be at the forefront of this service. This turned worldly hierarchies on their head, at least in spirit. Why was this so central? Monasteries saw themselves as oases of Christian life in a sometimes chaotic world. Offering hospitality was a vital way they interacted with that world, offering not just physical sustenance, but also a model of Christian charity and order. It was a form of evangelization, not necessarily through preaching, but through action. By showing such profound care for strangers, they demonstrated the love of God. Furthermore, Pilgrims were a common feature of medieval life, undertaking long and often dangerous journeys to holy shrines. Monasteries, strategically located along many pilgrimage routes, became essential stopping points, offering safe havens. Providing for these pilgrims was seen as a particularly meritorious act. The rule also instilled a sense of responsibility. These weren't just casual encounters. The monastery had a duty of care. This is why there were specific roles: porter, guest, master, and specific places: guest house, guest kitchen, dedicated to hospitality. It was an organized, integral part of monastic life, not an optional extra. Even convents of nuns, though perhaps with more restrictions on who could enter their private enclosure, also practiced hospitality, often having guest houses and providing for female travelers, the poor and pilgrims. The principles were the same. This deep-seated belief that hospitality was a holy obligation, a direct command from God, is what fueled the extraordinary efforts medieval monasteries put into welcoming strangers. It wasn't just about being nice. It was about living out the core message of their faith. It was quite literally a sacred trust. And it's why, even centuries later, the stories of their welcome continue to fascinate and inspire.